I was thinking about it the weekend when I was sitting here at home, that actually, like, it's nice being away from the hustle and bustle. So I was thinking about it more in that sense, right, of what solitude can mean to an individual in the self, and actually of why you want to maybe step back sometimes because you'd be caught up in that hustle and bustle. Whereas the isolation part was
Oh,
more
okay.
of like the loneliness or feeling you're in somewhere and you're not feeling like you fit in, So like, I don't know, you're in a company and they're
Yeah.
making silly jokes and that kind of thing. So that's what I was thinking of, maybe something a bit more around that in the self instead of like the big existential words of isolation, like defining them. And do you know what I mean?
I think it all blends in quite nicely, generally speaking, anyway, because those are really specific examples. And actually, when we think about understanding, I suppose, isolation, loneliness, and solitude, we have to break it down into those three different things. So, loneliness is a feeling, it's
Mm.
the feeling of sadness, basically, because you're on your own or you don't fit in. And then we can come to that other bit, start to talk about isolation. That isolation is an action. You either do it to yourself, so you become isolated, or others do it to you. And I think that's a really important thing that we can start to reflect just from hearing what you're talking
Mm-hmm.
about. And I suppose the difference between isolation and solitude is self inflicted. You have to choose that to grow. There has to be an aim to it. And
Mm-hmm.
there's some great books that we can touch on today. But that's how I think I would maybe approach that.
Yeah, definitely, because it is, that solitude is definitely that choice, isn't it? And it's either for good reasoning. I sometimes love being by myself and just going for a walk or being away and withdrawing. Whereas that isolation feeling, as you say, it's yeah, it can kind of not be put on you as such, but it can happen to you, not necessarily by your own choice.
Yeah, but I mean, I really would stick with that differential between solitude and isolation because ultimately, solitude and isolation, they both involve being alone. And that's where people get confused because, well,
Mm-hmm.
I'm on my own. And often, when you're choosing to, I suppose, enjoy a state of solitude, you've opted for that. And often, when we use the term isolation, we don't use solitude in the same way. So we don't go, oh, we've solituded him.
Mm-hmm.
No one uses that kind of language. We've isolated him. So often it's taken away, it's almost taken away from us. And that could just be due to the environment that we're living in, or it could just be, people being horrible to us, or it could be that something's going on with us. And crime and punishment is a really good example of how isolation can become this really vicious cycle that you start to be excluded from society, so you start to resent society, so you isolate yourself even further, and that can be really harmful to you. It's just an interesting, I suppose, tidbit, really.
Yeah, well, definitely, because that need or that feeling of getting further and further away, in some sense, you could go,
Mm,
well, actually, is that happening? Yeah, you're feeling that in that moment, but actually, that sense of, are you actively withdrawing yourself because you're feeling that way, or is it just, is that genuinely happening to you, right? Because I've had it where
mm,
joining a new company, and you go, oh, the first week goes, oh, this feels all right, but I don't feel like I quite fit in here. Well, I could at that point
yeah.
start taking myself back, but actually, you've got to look at it in the wider context that you've only just met these people. They're not your friends. They're colleagues. You're not going to know all the banter. You're not going to know all the social norms that you have as a group. So, that isolation is quite an emotional word as well. The isolation, isn't it? And as you say, no one ever talks about it in the essence of solitude, where you're choosing that yourself to, I don't know, maybe step back, reflect. And I think it's very easy to have those feelings of isolation, of not fitting in, or feeling that pain. But if you don't kind of stop and catch yourself sometimes, and it goes back to one of our famous words of that intentionality, right? Of just being an awareness of being, are you being intentional with withdrawing yourself, or are you actually kind of just aware that you're not feeling like you're fitting in somewhere, or you're seeking that, I don't know, discomfort maybe. And that to me, the
Mm.
discomfort is more towards the isolation side, whereas that comfort and reflectiveness space is how I see a bit more of the solitude.
Yeah, and there's a chap called David Thoreau, and he wrote a book called Walden. And effectively, it's a fascinating book because it's just about him living out in I want to say the wilds of a place called Walden. And he draws some pretty interesting philosophical distinctions.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that he talks a lot about there is choosing to intentionally withdraw from society. But he talks about it with the concept of choosing to understand life, to consider things more deeply. So seeking clarity and purpose. And then he goes on to highlight this idea of mindful living, so that his solitary lifestyle helps him, I think, basically confront the essential facts of being human or being him. And that it's through deliberate solitude, that's the term he uses, this deliberate solitude, that he avoids, I suppose, like the avoid, basically. And he is doing it to step away from something called the unexamined life, which Socrates himself talks about. And it's this notion that the unexamined life is not worth living. And David Thoreau picks that up and is like, well, how do we begin to understand that our life is unexamined? And that's how he does it, through solitude. It's a tool, basically. And I suppose when we're thinking about isolation and solitude and then loneliness, I'd come back to that. Well, loneliness is a feeling. It's a feeling of sadness. Isolation is an action. But solitude is a tool. It's something that you use to begin to achieve a certain goal almost. And that's purely based on thinking about David Thoreau.
Yeah, well, it's interesting at that bit of kind of withdrawing, because I think we hear and see a lot of people or go on, to see retreats or withdrawing or going to Nepal for 6 months to find yourself. I think we're not necessarily suggesting that, right? But elements of solitude yourself. I think I'm trying to think you could bring it back to more of the day to day in the sense of maybe just reflecting or having that meditation, right? Because we can't all disappear tomorrow on a 6-month retreat to Nepal.
I don't think it's always about meditating either. I think it's more about having that moment of catching up with yourself. It can be that simple. And Virginia Woolf, when she was talking about writing, she turned around and said, well, you have to have a quiet room by yourself to write. These kind of ideas, they're not new, they're quite historic. And that solitude is a very valuable thing. So it's so much so that what was it that David Thoreau said? He said something like, I've never found a companion that was so companionable as solitude. And you can feel the difference between those three things: solitude, isolation, and loneliness. You'll know the difference.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Well, that concept of having that space as well, I think is really important, as you say, regardless of how you kind of practice it, because it gives you that space to think and process those thoughts. We can all be, it's amazing how easy it is to be caught up in the busyness of life and actually, without doing and stopping and having that element of solitude. I think, as you say, it's a tool. That's a good way of putting it, actually. It's a tool that you can take to, a weekend to yourself or some time. There's no defined period with it, but you can take it and actually use it as an effective tool to, what's the way of putting it? To see if you're in alignment with whatever you want in a way, isn't it? Are you heading in the direction you want to? And you can use it in any context, really, I think.
Yeah, and that's that personal growth that Thoreau said, it was talking about, that you've got to have an objective to use for it. Solitude, that is. You can't just do it for the sake of doing it. And one of the things I also like to touch on as well is this idea of you could be surrounded by thousands of people and still be lonely. You could be in a room full of good friends and still be lonely.
Yeah. I think we can probably all feel that as well. Parties or, just being around these other people and weirdly feeling completely disconnected, which is an odd feeling in that sense. And that isolation, I think I've learned to kind of examine it a little more, of that, like the feeling that comes with it. Because if you're feeling lonely, or from my experience from it, there's often like a bit more of an underlying message that sits there. You have the feeling in the moment, but, do I feel like I'm not fitting in here? Or am I feeling a bit of anxiety because I'm, I don't know, going out of my comfort zone to do something? So I think it goes back to that awareness piece of if you're feeling that feeling of loneliness and withdrawing, why? Where's that coming from? And it's not to say that you should challenge it and crush it, because I think we can all sit in that space, but it's not getting stuck in that space, to your point about that individual who keeps just continuously withdrawing from situations.
Yeah, and I think loneliness it is dangerous, as we can see in Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov's proclivity to violence because he's so lonely and isolated that he begins to resent everyone around him is a cautionary tale. But the other element that it's dangerous that we haven't actually spoken about is that loneliness can drive you to seek out bad company. And I think there are so many people who, because they feel bored and lonely and isolated, that they'll go and hang out with people who maybe don't have the best intentions toward them. You'll put yourself at risk to keep that feeling away because we're social creatures. Loneliness physically hurts. Your brain will register that painful emotion as almost like physical pain. And we've seen that in studies to do with adolescence. That emotional rejection, that kind of isolation, it hurts. And we want to avoid that in many, many situations. So we'll go and hang out with the person who's maybe doing a lot of drugs or a lot of drinking, or maybe might be doing some other harmful habits. And it's remembering, actually, just because I'm lonely now doesn't mean I have to engage in something that hurts me.
Which it's making those choices, isn't it? And realizing that you're making those choices because, as you say, we all seek that connectivity, and it's very easy to get in that trap. I almost put social media in that bucket as well sometimes because you talk to all these people.
Oh yeah,
because you feel
100%.
that need. You feel that need. There's that need there, but you never really. Well, I don't know. Maybe people can tell they do otherwise, but I don't think I've ever closed a social media app and felt fulfilled. Or no.
Unless you're watching Satori Sounds content, then you feel really fulfilled, rather. You're right, though. It's a drain, and we almost get addicted to that oxytocinal component of it. It feels good in the moment, and then it's gone, and it's learning not to chase that.
And learning sometimes that it's okay to kind of feel that loneliness. There doesn't need to be an immediate, cure to it. Some days you're going to take time by yourself and not feel okay with it. There isn't, it's a state, isn't it? Right. You don't live in this constant space of feeling completely fulfilled or needing isolation from people. I think it's just that larger aspect of, if that's continuously coming, as you say, not falling into those hazards that can put you into more of a negative space. But I think we can all say we've been there in different forms with isolation, right? Of that feeling of being alone, and not connected from people. It's important that we reach out to different groups and friends if people are feeling that. But overall, I think isolation, the word itself. The word isolation itself, I think, I don't know, to me, it feels like it's got a slightly negative connotation anyway, because you think of singling out someone. It's like it's isolated. They're put aside from everyone else.
Yeah, it is to effectively be kept away from others. That's, if we get the most basic of definitions, it's being shunned almost. And if you think about it in a medical sense, during COVID, for instance, we've isolated that person because they're infectious. Or we've isolated that person because they do things that we don't want to do. We've shunned that person almost. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It does have that negative connotation, and it comes back to what I said earlier. We never ever say we solituded that person, because it doesn't have the same connotation, doesn't have the same meaning.
Yeah.
And I think, coming back to that text by David Thoreau, one of the things that I really like that he does is he talks about companionship. I think this guy was way ahead of his time, because he wrote this, I think, almost in the 1900s, maybe even earlier. But he was talking about how, one, emotional connection is not necessarily equal to physical proximity. So just because you're close to people around you and you have people around you doesn't necessarily mean you have the emotional connection. It's not an equivocal thing, basically. These concepts aren't necessarily linked. And the other thing that he draws on quite nicely is this idea of companionship, that it can operate in different capacities, and that there are different ways of feeling companionship or feeling like you've got things going on. Now, he talks about it in the context of nature and plants and birds and kind of wildlife. But there are lots of different ways that we can slice that. So, for instance, relationships aren't time specific. And one of the things I often say to people that I've worked with after a long period of time is, yes, our working relationship with our physical contact is coming to an end, but there are pieces of work that we've done together that will stay living and breathing, that evidence that we still have that working relationship when you move on from here. And you can think about that in every other relationship that you've had. So be it your work relationship with mentors, be it old friendships, these relationships don't just die, and they're not necessarily time specific. You take the most meaningful things of it with you when you go forward. And that's another form of companionship.
It's interesting. I don't think I've ever looked at companionship in that way. But you're right, because we all take these little building blocks, don't we, that go forth. So whilst the individual and the time with that person maybe has come to an end, there are elements that you've taken through that. And I think you can apply that to family and loved ones as well, in a way, I think, where people have maybe lost someone, or that feeling of that loss and loneliness. Well, maybe the individual's not there anymore, but there's so much of those memories or those little mannerisms or things that remind you. So actually, the physical companionship isn't there, but that mental construct that you've got and all the memories for those people. I really like that, actually. It's a really nice way of framing it.
Yeah. It's definitely, and coming back to that sense of grief, that's definitely got me through difficult things. That actually, now that this person's passed, that they're still here in many ways. They're still alive in my memories. When maybe I go fishing and I remember how a specific person taught me how to fish, or maybe I remember a song that someone introduced to me that's no longer here or that I no longer see. That's a living, breathing example of our relationships kind of ongoing, and it's alive because I remember it. And it's a fascinating thing, I think, to think
Isn't
about
it?
Companionship like that, or relationships like that.
Definitely. It's amazing how music can do that, actually. How music can make you feel so connected to a memory. You're just sitting there 1 minute, and then, a song comes on and it's like, bang, here's this vivid memory.
Yeah. Cutting shapes, you're like, yeah, I remember when I was young and fit.
Dude, you're not even 30.
Given the...
You're not old. What do you mean, when I was young?
I feel old inside.
Old soul. He's an old soul.
Decrepit. Yeah, it feels like that sometimes. Yeah. I think coming back to that idea of bad company as well, and how loneliness can drive us to seek out people that you're not friendly with. I remember having that thought when I was in college, and I just remember being like, why am I hanging out with this particular person? This particular person's a bad vibe. Like, what am I doing? And why am I here? What's the point? Do I feel good now, how I've hung out with the person? No, I feel drained. I feel tired. And I really encourage listeners to pay attention to that sensation. Say you've gone and met with that friend you don't really want to meet with, and I say friend, quote in quotes, or acquaintance, and you've gone and met with them and you think, oh, what was the point? Notice that.
Yeah. Very much so, because it's easy to keep showing up in that way, isn't it? You almost think it's serving you, right? You're seeing these people, but you never feel, I know you're necessarily fully connected to these people, or you never feel good in that sense. So it's important to pay attention to those feelings, and also the opposite. If people are, some things won't always serve you. So you might be enjoying something, but actually got to the point where it doesn't have that same connectivity for you, right? In that sense. And I think I can think of that in many senses of different stages of friendships with people. It's amazing how younger in life you felt so connected with certain people. And then you've got some people reaching out to you now who you're thinking, well, we have nothing else in common really anymore. There's not that connectivity. There's not that friendship. And I'd rather be isolated from you. No.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I'd rather not have any contact with you. And that is such a poignant way of framing it, because I can identify with that so much. One of the things I was thinking about recently was the idea of when you're younger, you have such few interests in the world because the world hasn't unfolded to you yet. And then as you go on to develop yourself, you find way more interests, way more things to occupy your time. And that causes you to change naturally. when you go back to interact with those people that you think, oh man, I'd rather not hang out with you, it's because your interests have diverted so much that you've changed as people and they're not aligned anymore. And that's a normal thing to have happen. It's like when you move town and you go back to that town that you were in before and you think, Jesus, ooh, not sure I share that belief system or that view.
It is funny in a way though, because that change can create a loneliness in itself, because you've gone through that own development, right? And you're into this new chapter, and you don't quite fit in with the friends that you used to have, but you haven't really found a new friendship group that shares that kind of thought or ideas. And I think that's important for the listeners to realize as well, is that through that growth, you will lose some people. That's just the reality, know, and that isn't, you're probably going to go through an element of loneliness through your own growth stages, and that is okay.
Transition is one of the loneliest things to experience because no one else can necessarily see your vision, the thing that you're going for. And so you'll spend a lot of time trying to explain it to people and they may not get it. And, again, coming back to something we said in the other episodes, people have their own processing issues. So they might internalize that it's something to do with them. They also might be undergoing their own transition, which you can't quite see. And as a result, you don't gel. But you're right, it can make you feel lonely. But upon reflection, there's a really, really famous fable from Aesop about hanging out with the wrong people and hanging out with relationships that don't serve you. And it's about a hermit and a bear. And basically this bear comes along to this hermit I think he's lived on his own for, I can't remember the amount of time that he gives in the story. But the bear and the hermit eventually become friendly. And the hermit was initially hesitant at first because he was like, well, he is a bear. He's got some strange things that I don't really want around me. But they lived together peacefully for a time. And eventually, while the hermit is napping, a fly comes in and it's just buzzing around the place, bothering everyone. Now, the bear wants to be helpful because he sees him as a friend, but he doesn't really know how to do that. So he immediately, as soon as the fly lands on the hermit's face, he immediately swipes at the fly and smashes the hermit in the face. Now, the moral of that story is a foolish friend can be more dangerous than a wise enemy. Companionship is often desirable, but not all company is good. And I suppose it does humorously touch on the dangers of misguided friendships and, in some regards, overzealous help. And it's noticing, actually, now that I've transitioned to this other place, does hanging out with this person drag me back to an old place that I don't want to be in?
I think that's a really good and vivid story, because you say there was no bad intention necessarily from that bear, but also the other individual wouldn't have necessarily, or the hermit wouldn't have understood it in that context as well. So I think you do have to be aware of that company that you're keeping as well, because whilst people may not necessarily intentionally be trying to bring you backwards because they're on their own path, they might be doing you that disservice. So actually, it's good. And we've talked about it with setting boundaries with people before, right? But it's good to put those boundaries in place. And people might go, "Well, I can't do that because I need the companionship." I can definitely see, and I felt it, I think, myself sometimes, where you are feeling lonely, so you think, "Well, I'll meet up with these people from a bit of companionship." But that was me when I was younger. Now I'm in a bit more of a state where I kind of go, "I'd rather spend the time with myself than hang out with people that I don't want to."
Yeah, absolutely. You begin to work out that time on your own that you actually enjoy is far more valuable than time that you'd use hanging out with people that you don't want to hang out with. You think, why am I doing that? What's the point? So, you know what? My advice is, if you're at that party and you're not enjoying it, leave early. Go hang out, get a pizza. Do whatever you want on your own. Don't be in a space that you don't want to be in for, not unnecessarily. I'm not saying that go and walk out of your job, per se. You know what I mean?
Leave right now, grab a pizza.
Facts. I don't care what your job is. You could be a surgeon. Just leave mid-operation. Watch the story sounds.
We're going to need some legal advice on that bit.
Oh no, we're cancelled again. Oh no.
It's so true.
But I do really urge people. Oh, yeah, go on.
Well, I think we're going to say the same message, right? Is that don't keep yourself in situations just because you've got that companionship, right? And the thing I was going to bring in there as well is it can almost go too far the other way. right? I've definitely, people have
Mm,
jokingly said that I went into monk mode and I'd sort of the space, and I was seeking solitude at that point. I was reevaluating a lot of things, and
mhm,
I'd, withdrawn from social media, withdrawn from a lot of my friendship groups. People started joking and be like, oh, you're hard to get hold of, but like, cer- certain people have now been like, I just can't get hold of you, and it's not for one of lack of it, but them trying. It's just me. I'd withdrawn so much that
mm,
actually I couldn't come back into that space. And I suddenly realized that that was unhealthy in its sense, right? Of withdrawing that much. So I think
mm,
you definitely need to put yourself first. But I think there also comes a point when you need to understand that having that much space away from everyone in itself can be unhealthy because you get dangerously addicted to your own company. And actually, you do need some social dynamics and constructs to come the other way. So I think what we're saying for the
mm,
readers here is that there's a balance with it and that you need to identify the feelings that you have associated with why you want to seek some solitude or why you're feeling
mm,
alone through that isolation. And it comes back to our two favorite words of
mm.
intentionality and awareness.
Yeah, to paraphrase Dr. Samuel Johnson, I think his name is, or is it? Because he was a poet back in the day, but I think in the 1700s. But one of the things that he said was that isolation is dangerous to reason without being favorable to virtue. And you've got to hold that in mind, that just isolating yourself can be really, really unproductive. And there's a concept in psychology that we talk about when we talk about beliefs, and it's called ungrounded thinking. Sometimes you need other people to balance out your thinking. So it comes back to the book Crime and Punishment. He's doing lots of ungrounded thinking, and it gets to the point where his thinking is so ungrounded and so entrenched that by the time he goes to check in with others, he completely rejects their understanding of reality, and it drives him mad almost. Obviously, Fyodor Dostoevsky is, an extreme example,
Of course.
but it is palpable. It's a cautionary tale.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Well, it is. You need that because if we step back, and this is probably bringing it into a big thought pattern here, but if you actually step back and you think of the reality that we have around us, right? All of this stems from people's thoughts and ideas. And so actually,
Yeah.
whilst we live in this group of societies and everything else, everything that we've said, everything that people say, and everything that's done, they are just thoughts and beliefs that we have all constructed. And, that's where a lot of people don't feel that isolation because they've got those beliefs that they have together. So I think it's just people to be aware
Mm,
of that you can feel that alone and you can hear other people's ideas as well. But you need to be able to make your own mind up and make sure you're in alignment with where you want to be going. And I think that comes bring back to the solitude point of sometimes you need to disconnect that to go, hold on, all this is happening around me. Is this really where I want to be going?
mm. Oh, absolutely. And I suppose leaning into Socrates' unexamined life comment, to examine a life fully and to examine your life fully, you do have to, one, at some point disconnect, go into solitude, think about what it is you want to make, what point you want to make, and also bring yourself back. You can't live in that solitude forever.
Yeah.
Because it can, and this is the other thing we haven't touched on, solitude can tip into isolation. If you're not careful, you go, I don't want to know anyone else. I like my world. And that's not necessarily conducive either, particularly in 2025 when the world is so interconnected.
Hugely, hugely. But I enjoy my own time. I don't need anyone else.
People? Oh. Oh. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so true though, because we are super, it's super easy to connect. We're not even in the same side of the country at the minute, and yet we can
Mm,
do this, right? So that there is that opportunity to connect and to reach out to people, and there are so many tools out there as well nowadays, not necessarily social media,
mm,
but if you are feeling in that alone space or you're you're feeling withdrawn, then reach out to those people that are around you, But also if you're in the other space of complete solitude and you've gone into monk mode and no one's seen you for 2 years, maybe you want to reconsider coming back out.
yeah. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory in many regards, and it's just highlighting again, physical proximity does not guarantee emotional connectivity, and neither does time. I've got loads of friends I haven't seen for ages, and then we've met up again, and it's like nothing changed. And it's balancing that. Time and proximity don't necessarily affect relationships in the way that we think it might. And also being aware of your early warning signs. Am I in solitude right now, or am I in isolation? What does that look like for me? Have I been here before? When I was here before, what happened? How did I get out of it? And it's using referential data is what I like to say, basically.